Good afternoon and welcome to our 6th program of SNED Talks. Some of you were here those first couple of times when we had about 40 people here, and you're still coming, and we appreciate you so much. I told somebody a minute ago, I realized I have just a really high opinion of people who attend SNED Talks. I mean, truly, because your presence is an indication of how you value education. So, and as many of you know, at this time, we always like to honor our inspiration, the late educator, Isabel Lumsden Couch. Isabel would have a big grin on her face if she were here. And this community has a wonderful collective memory of Isabel, and it's just a good time to remember her. Other people we want to thank: committee members Ann Gillespie, Tony Reed, Barbara Williams, none of whom will stand up, but they worked really hard to make this event happen. Sam Williams, who created our logo and puts together our program every time along with Barbara. Roger Williams, our excellent videographer, and SauteeLive.com is his other AKA. Dee Dee Vogt, who is our wonderful coordinator here at the center. Janice Limburner, who always smiles at you and with her beautiful smile when she takes up your money. Cindy and Mike Grace donated this wonderful podium to the community center for us to use. Yeah, isn't it great? And I can vouch for the fact that you really do feel more secure behind this. And finally, Linda Harding. Last time I threatened to give a SNED talk on Linda Harding, but that's still in the works. Linda does all the sound, lights, and most of all, she works and works and works ahead of time to put together the images for the speakers. Thank you, Linda. Okay, so today's theme is on closer inspection. Each of our speakers will talk for about 15 minutes, after which they'll take some questions. I want to say right now, I'm sorry I'm going on a little bit long, but the speakers have worked so hard and are so wonderful, and just when you stop and think about it, they're the whole reason we're able to have these talks at all. So you will enjoy their presentations today so much. So after the program's over, there'll be refreshments in the Crittenden room, and you can talk to the speakers some more. Also, let's see, some housekeeping things. Restrooms, the women's is down this way, the men's down that way. You see the exit signs in the back and the side. And we need to ask you not to take pictures during the talks, and also to be sure your cell phones are turned off. Thank y'all. So first up is Billy Chism, known to most of already known to most of you as the illustrious former editor of the White County News. Billy, who lives in Decorum with his wife Patty, is enjoying his retirement, and some of you may not know, is teaching a writing class at nearby LOE Retreat Center. So if you're interested in writing, be sure and talk to Billy afterward about the classes. Billy's talk today is entitled, "What Journalism is For and Why It Should Matter to You."
Full house. Did you know that the job of news reporter has a distinction of being one of the worst occupations in America? Now, where did this information come from? Well, I got it off the internet, so it must be true. Now understand, internet poll or not, being a news reporter, a journalist, is not the easiest or most beloved job around. But being a journalist has been and will continue to be one of the most important professions in America. I will tell you why I believe this is true and why journalism is essential to American democracy. First, some background. I grew up in the 1950s and 1960s in a small town in southwest Georgia, Pelham, located on US 19 between Albany and Thomasville. At the time, Pelham was a farming community with a number of small manufacturing plants. The town's population was about 4,000. In 1925, my grandfather, J.B. Chism Sr., bought the local weekly newspaper, the Pelham Journal. He was the paper's editor and publisher. He was also the lone linotype operator. Those big linotype machines produced the type one line at a time, and those lines of type put together became galleys, and those galleys of type, along with the headlines and cut lines and engraved photos, were physically placed on a big slab of stone, locked down and put on a flatbed press. Broadsheets were fed into the press, one sheet at a time, and the printed page came off the press, still wet with ink. Really, my only memory of my grandfather was at the newspaper office. When I was only 4, my grandfather died. My father, J.B. Chism Jr., took over as editor and publisher. He also set type on that big linotype machine. By the time I reached age 9, and I'm really about 14 in that picture, but by the time I reached age 9, I began working at the paper part-time, inserting sections of the paper together every Wednesday afternoon. In a few years, my father taught me how to take photographs with a speed graphic camera. That camera weighed almost as much as I did. By the time I was in the 8th grade, my father taught me to develop film and print photos in the Pelham Journal darkroom. In high school, I wrote stories and took plenty of sports photos, but also took many other photos in the community that appeared in the paper. By the time I got to the University of Georgia, I had decided to major in journalism and minor in history and sociology. My early thoughts were to take over the paper in Pelham. That didn't happen. What did happen was this. At UGA, I began to see journalism in a whole different light. I learned about the theories of the press, learned about the importance that news organizations play in all free countries, learned that our democracy depends on a free press. I also began to realize that my father and my grandfather were real journalists, reporting and writing stories about the city council, the school board, and other important stories that mattered. Curiosity served me well at UGA. I loved every course I took, and I got a solid liberal arts education. I still have the paperback book from a sociology class, The Nature of Prejudice, and this is relevant today as it was back then. My Introduction to Mass Communications course offered plenty of food for thought. That's where I was introduced to the two theories of the press, the Authoritarian Theory and the Libertarian Theory. In a nutshell, the state is exalted at the expense of individuals in the authoritarian press theory. The press is government-owned and dedicated to furthering the dictatorship that exists in the government. You only have to look at Russia, China, or North Korea as the perfect example of the authoritarian press theory. Now, the libertarian press theory goes like this. People are presumed able themselves to discern between truth and falsehood. Under this theory, when citizens are exposed to a free press, they use the information that they get when they vote and when they weigh in on public issues. Under the libertarian theory, it is essential that all people have access to a free press. My first newspaper job out of college was a reporter at a weekly newspaper, the Decorum Record in Decorum, Georgia, about 30 miles from here. The year was 1973. At the Decorum Record, I covered everything. City Commission, County Commission, school boards, the schools themselves, the courts, police, fire department, Georgia State Patrol, you name it, I covered it. And let me tell you some of the things I learned about being a reporter and how this later will explain what journalism is for. First, there's nothing like being there when you report. You're an eyewitness. You get the feel of the place, the people there, The noise, the atmosphere, even the smell, the back and forth between people, being physically at a place is important. Secondly, a good reporter is like a good detective. There's no better way to report than wearing out shoe leather, being on the street. Part of this work involves cultivating sources, people who are willing to talk freely and truthfully to you. These can be secretaries, teachers, people down the ladder who work in government offices. It's amazing how they will help you if they know you. Good sources pay off in good stories. But these sources must be cultivated over time. I was the first reporter on the scene at 6 a.m. with my camera and notepad after the dam break at the Toccoa Falls College in Toccoa in November 1977. The reason I was there on the scene, an emergency room nurse called my apartment at 5:30 a.m. and told me that something bad had happened. She said she wasn't sure what, but she told me people were coming into the emergency room. They were wet and all beat up and cut up. Yes, good sources pay off in good stories. Finally, I learned that if there's a story, my job is to tell it truthfully and as fully as possible. I shouldn't self-censor a story. That's why I never talk to people off the record. If I knew something, it was on the record and fair game to write about, if it made sense to do so. I left the newspaper world on January 1st, 1978, when I joined the corporate world and became a corporate communicator. But in my heart, I remained a reporter. That's why, almost 30 years later, I applied for the editor and publisher's job at the White County News in Cleveland, Georgia. It was only then that the lessons from the Henry W. Grady School of Journalism began to pay off. Press freedom became something important to me. And when reporter Denise Etheridge and I went to see a septic waste disposal operation in the south part of White County, we met with the owner who really wanted to show us his party house and his horse farm, which served as a front entrance for his septic waste operation. We insisted on seeing those operations behind the horse stables, and to his credit, he took us there. As we walked to the back of the property, a truck filled with septic waste pulled up. I later learned that 20 to 30 trucks a day unloaded their septic waste material at this location. We looked on as the toxic waste was pumped into a big concrete pit where chemicals were added to reduce the stench. We later walked to the pastures where the wastewater was spread over the fields through an irrigation process. As we looked at the irrigation fields, I noticed a tractor in another nearby field, and it was pulling a spreader. And I watched that spreader, and as I watched, black, thick septic waste was being spread right on top of the ground. I turned to the owner and asked about this procedure. He told me they had stopped spreading waste on the ground this way and instead were using only the irrigation technique. Now, he told me this as I watched with my own eyes the spreading operation as it was happening. Do people lie? Do they tell you things to confuse you, to throw you off track? You be the judge. We reported in the next edition what was discussed and what we saw, and included photographs, and told what was happening at this septic waste operation. Thanks to Denise's persistent ongoing reporting and a lawsuit from nearby neighbors, things finally got a little better. But let me tell you something. Whether it's people in business, city government, county government, state government, federal government, they want you to know their spin on things. And guess what? Sometimes they bend the truth. Sometimes they outright lie. I have seen it in local governments. I can assure you it happens in business, state government, and federal government. So, as a citizen, what can you do to stay informed? You can just take the word of government or a business owner, whatever is sent out in a press release or put on their website. Or you can depend on a reliable news source, a reliable, responsible news source to learn what is going on. So, what is journalism for? The primary purpose of journalism is to provide citizens with the information they need to be free and self-governing. That's why journalism exists, as authors Bill Kovach and Tom Rosenstiel in their book, The Elements of Journalism. Now let me repeat, the primary purpose of journalism is to provide citizens, you, with the information you need to be free and self-governing. Here are some key elements of journalism. Journalism's first obligation is to the truth. Now, we could spend days talking about what is truth, but remember, journalism exists in a social context. Out of necessity, citizens and societies depend on accurate and reliable accounts of events. Ironically, finding the truth today takes more work than ever because there's so much information available, not to mention a total disregard for the truth by some in leadership positions. All this is being magnified by social media, which has been transformed into a boiling cauldron of half-truths and full-blown lies. What Winston Churchill said 75 years ago is more relevant today. And this is what he said: a lie gets halfway around the world before truth has a chance to get its pants on. Journalism, its first loyalty is to citizens. Who do journalists work for? The readers and the viewers, of course. Citizens must be put first, and journalists must have the final say over the news. Journalism, its essence is the discipline of verification. In the end, verification is what separates journalism from entertainment, propaganda, fiction, art. Journalism alone is focused on getting what happened down right. By contrast, propaganda selects facts or invents them to serve its real purpose, which is manipulation of the public. Journalism, its practitioners must maintain an independence from those they cover. I think this one speaks for itself. The best book I've ever read on this is Reporter by Seymour Hersh. He covered the Pentagon and wrote investigative stories for a number of publications. Read it if you want to see the inner workings of covering the Pentagon, the White House, the CIA. Deception is part of the workday at these places. All Seymour Hersh wanted to do was report what really happened. Journalism, its practitioners have an obligation to exercise their own conscience. Now think about this one. Every journalist must have a personal sense of ethics and responsibility, a moral compass. I know all good reporters have this. It's vital, really. Journalism, citizens too, that's you, have rights and responsibilities when it comes to the news. Yes, you as citizens have responsibilities. I think one of the most responsible things anyone can do is read a variety of publications. It pains me when I realize somebody is depending on one network or one cable show to get their news. Paying attention is work, and we can choose to be informed or not informed. Being informed can be painful at times. This cartoon from the New Yorker magazine may sum it up. Let me tell you, I believe in a free press with all my heart. It's not something we should take lightly. Can you imagine network news going black on TV screens, or radio news turning to static, or major newspapers and magazines thwarted in their effort to do their job, or censored outright? Before ending, I want you to know the question that I was asked the most while I was in the news business. And the question was this: how can you be objective? Well, none of us are robots. We all come from differing backgrounds, have differing experiences in our childhoods, our school days, our family life, our work life. We are all individuals. When you look at this photograph from the 1950s, you see a woman and two little guys sitting on some steps. If you examine this photo, you'll see it with your own eyes, based on your own experiences, your own perspective. You have your own interpretation, and I have mine. And here is mine. The boy on the left with his shirt off is Michael Faber. I'm sitting next to him with my tongue out. Michael lived next door and was 1 year older than me. He had 3 younger brothers, and we played nearly every summer day in the backyard and in the nearby woods. But here's where my perspective differs. Michael's family was Jewish. There were 2 Jewish families in Pelham, only 2. And my parents were friends with both families. I was close friends with the children growing up. But I saw prejudice rear its ugly head when the Faber boys were in high school, something that surprised and shocked me. Of course, I also saw plenty of prejudices living in a county where the population was 65% African American. It was my mother, Francine Neal Chism, seated on those steps, who gave me a set of values, a moral compass, if you will. She taught me that all people were equal and should be treated with kindness. She taught me to stand up for the underdog. Her values were instilled in me and helped me to become a pretty good journalist. Yes, those values and a whole lot of curiosity on my part. I hope you have a better understanding of why a free press is essential to our democracy. Our precious rights, after all, are what really define us and make us Americans. Thank you. We'll take just a few questions, and then Priscilla will cut you off if you can't. But I'd like one or two or three, and then we'll get going with the other two speakers. Yes?
Hey, Bill, would you say your reporting on the septic waste facility was an example of muckraking?
Yes. Next question. You rascal, Ted. Absolutely. Next? Yes.
When you look at the state of news and fake news today, if you had to pick one or two newspapers to get national news from, who would you suggest?
Well, I'll just tell you right now, and I can, I would be booed at a Trump rally, but that bothers me a lot. The New York Times is undoubtedly the best newspaper in America, and it has been for years and years and years. But let me tell you, this thing about fake news, there's no such thing. It's either news or it's not. There's, I don't know. It's just incorrect, I guess, or something. But there are newspapers all over this country that every day, weekly papers, daily newspapers, big papers, small papers, magazines, there are people, I think there's more people in journalism today than ever because of the different outlets. But you've got to find these outlets and you've got to believe in them. But the best thing is to read a lot of different things. I read the New York Times. I get it on every morning, but I read a lot of other things too. And sometimes I watch things that I don't want to watch just to see what they're saying, and I can only take so much of it and I move on. But it, yeah. Does that help? I don't know. Yes, Jim.
Well, one thing that bothers me, I guess this is more of a statement or comment. I know people who will reject any information from what I consider legitimate sources. They just discount it. Like if you bring up the New York Times or Washington Post or whatever, as far as they're concerned, that's not legitimate journalism. And they wouldn't bother, they wouldn't consider the point because of the source.
Well, let me just say this. They can think all they want to, but I can assure you, these people are not working for the government. They are working for the citizens of this country. They understand exactly what I was talking about. They look at themselves as keepers of democracy, just like the judicial system. I'll just tell you, who's being attacked right now by our own government? The press and the judicial system. Why? Because they are major checks on dictatorships. And so people can say what they want. I know these journalists, they aren't doing it for the fun of it. They're doing it's a job, but it's also a calling for the really good ones. And let me tell you, the things that Bob Woodruff wrote, not Woodruff, he's the head of code. Woodward wrote, Woodward, yeah. I guarantee you, I count on that as being true. And let me tell you, I'm glad you, which begs this question. He said, the truth emerges. When I was taking pictures for trying to, I was at the University of Georgia and I walked through the old journalism school, which is now, it was the business school and now it's something else. But there's a big mural, there's two big murals in there. But then there's a kind of a real weird mural at the top. And there's some stuff in Latin which I couldn't read because I didn't understand. But then they translated it for people like me. And it says, truth, time discloses all things. And it's kind of what Woodward was saying. The truth will eventually emerge in everything. It always does. And all reporters are doing, all the news people are doing, is telling what they consider the truth. Now, could they be wrong at times? Yes. But for the majority of the time, they're reporting what's happening. And sometimes that can be disheartening. Anybody else? And then I gotta go.
Back here.
One more.
Thank you for that talk. My question is simply, what did you most enjoy about journalism?
Well, it wasn't going to city commission meetings and school board meetings. I will tell a truism now that I've told other people. The reason I came to work as the editor and publisher of the White County News in 2007 is because I wanted a job, but that wasn't the only reason. The main reason is I knew that Sautee Nacoochee was part of White County, and we had already bought a cabin up here, and I wanted to be part of this community, and because I felt a part of it, and I became a part of it. And so without Sautee Nacoochee, I would have never even been here. So that was my most enjoyable part, was just learning the people in the community. And not only the people here, but the people in Cleveland and Helen and all out in the countryside. Okay, thank you.
She earned her degree in advertising from the Grady School of Journalism. So University of Georgia is well represented today. And Cindy worked in advertising in Atlanta before meeting her husband, Mike, and then living in Mobile, Chicago, and Traverse City, Michigan, before returning to White County. Cindy will share some fascinating things she has learned about World War I in her talk, Great War, Great Changes.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to put on my reading glasses because a friend of mine told me that if y'all are fuzzy, I won't be so nervous. And also I can read my script. I'd actually like to start this with a little true confession. And that is, if you told me this time last year I would be giving you a talk on the Great War, I would have just dissolved into a fit of giggles, because what I knew about World War I could actually fit in a thimble. The one thing that I did know is that my grandfather, John Lumpkin Foster, was drafted. He didn't fight because he was profoundly deaf, but he was also apparently not thrilled with his middle name, since he signed his draft card, John Lewis Foster. However, in 1936, he had no qualms about giving my father the same name, John Lumpkin Foster Jr., who named my brother, John Lumpkin Foster III, who named my nephew, John Lumpkin Foster IV. And if you ask me, that's a lot of Lumpkins at the behest of a man who fudged his name on his draft card. So, again, in the spirit of full disclosure, I need to tell you that my expertise in the Great War would now probably fill a shot glass. But I have diligently and doggedly been researching this since last year. Like Billy, I'm a journalist, and when something piques my interest, I tend to go down a rabbit hole in search of information. And so last year, two things happened that sparked my curiosity. First, last June, I was in Washington, D.C. when I saw a short film entitled Women of Resilience, How the Daughters of the American Revolution Impacted World War I. It was at this conference I heard something that astonished me. The Great War, the war to end all wars, did not have a national memorial. In fact, on the 100th anniversary of the end of the World War I Centennial Foundation is raising funds to establish a memorial in Pershing Park. A few months later, I was back home in White County, and the White County News published a letter to the editor on Veterans Day. The letter concerned White County resident Hezekiah Miller, an African American and a veteran of World War I. The writer was asking that on Veterans Day we remember him, that we should remember all of our veterans, and I found it sad that this was something we needed to be reminded of. Then I realized But the two bits of information I had gleaned about the Great War involved minorities, women and African Americans. Like most public school students of the 60s and 70s, my history books relied on the contributions of minorities, so I set out to discover more. But before I get into specifics, let's do a quick overview of World War I. It started in the summer of 1914 when Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir apparent to the Habsburg throne of Austria-Hungary, was assassinated in Sarajevo by a revolutionary, hoping that his death would mean that Austria-Hungary would cease invading small countries. Ironically, the death of Ferdinand meant that we did go to war, because had he inherited the throne, he would have not pursued a war, guessing correctly that a war would also involve Russia. He said, "To peace, what would we get out of war with Serbia? We'd lose the lives of young men and we'd spend money better used elsewhere. And what would we gain for heaven's sake? Some plum trees and pastures full of goat droppings." So Austria-Hungary, after the assassination, gave an ultimatum to Serbia, one that many speculate was designed not to be able to be accepted. And when it was not, they declared war on Serbia. Russia, naturally, joined to defend Serbia. And with Russia in the fray, Germany joined to defend Austria-Hungary, and because Russia was involved, their ally France joined in support. And in the meantime, economic concerns over trade routes along their vast worldwide empire enticed England to join the war in an attempt to protect their assets. Now, Germany felt that engaging England on other fronts would distract them from the battlefields of France. And before the war was over, battles would be fought in Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, as well as many locations at sea. Now, President Woodrow Wilson and the U.S. were pushed into the war by Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare that significantly impacted our ships, and the interception of the Zimmermann telegram, the telegram in which Germany proposed an alliance with Mexico. Finally, on November the 11th, 1918, Germany signed an armistice that had been prepared by Britain and France, effectively ending the war. Sadly, the agreement that was ultimately reached was so punitive towards the losing countries that it led to the rise of Hitler in World War II. The Great War was the catalyst for the Russian Revolution, when the peasants had had enough of being suppressed by the aristocracy. In England, women fought for and in some capacity gained the right to vote, and just 2 years after the end of the war, American women gained the right to vote. It was also the beginning of a period called the Great Migration. It was a time in American history when more than 6 million African Americans from the rural South began to move north away from our Jim Crow laws. Sensing the opportunity to earn the respect of their white neighbors, many African American men were willing to fight in this war, and an act was passed saying that all males between the ages of 21 and 31 were required to register for the draft. Each side of the war felt that they were in the right and that the fighting wouldn't last very long. Germans marched into war with "God is with us" on their belt buckles, while British propaganda posters featured St. George slaying the dragon. But make no mistake, World War I was brutal. Soldiers utilized the latest in military technology, in weapons and in ships. It was also the first large-scale use of chemical warfare. In the end, 37 million people, civilians and soldiers, lost their life in a merciless way. World War I poet Wilfred Owen gave voice to the excruciating horrors of the war, and here's a segment from his poem, Dulce et Decorum Est. Bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and toward our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched to sleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on bloodshod. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. So now that you have a little background, I'd like to share the specifics I discovered. The deeper I started to dig, interesting, the more Georgia figures I uncovered. It was a wonderful thing to see this tapestry of history start to take form with the inclusion of interesting people from the state where I was born and reared. And because I am one, let's start with the women. The short documentary I saw that introduced me to the fact that women had this enormous role in World War I saw at Continental Congress for the Daughters of the American Revolution. And naturally, I would not be a good daughter of the American Revolution if I didn't share with you some of the amazing things that daughters accomplished during this war. Many volunteered with the American Red Cross, either collecting supplies or training its nurses. 262 DAR members went on to serve as nurses. This was also the first time that women traveled abroad, and Jane Delano, a daughter and the founder of the American Red Cross Nursing Services, and several other women gave their lives. DAR members raised $30,000 to send 16 ambulances to Europe. They raised $148,000 for the Commission for Relief in Belgium, and they sold $36 million worth of Liberty loans. And this is in 1918 money. This is not, so it was vastly more in today's dollars. And this is one of my favorites. They sent 94,000 jars of jelly and 300,000 knitted items to civilians in France that were impacted by the war. They also launched an initiative to re-chickenize France. And I'm here proudly supporting this initiative. Funds were raised to supply eggs, chicks, incubators, and a year's salary to a wounded soldier to oversee poultry production. So after learning about the enormous efforts taken on behalf or undertaken by the daughters, I went upstairs to visit the DAR archives, where all these World War I artifacts are on display. And it was there that I learned about a Georgian, a lovely lady named Moena Bell Michael, the Poppy Lady. She's the one that penned the poem in response to John McCrae's In Flanders Fields poem, which I'm sure everybody here knows. And she's also the one who established the poppy as a sign of remembrance. So since McCrae's poem is well known, I won't read it, but I will read a small section from We Shall Keep the Faith. And the entire poem's on the visual. And now the torch and poppy red we wear in honor of our dead. Fear not that ye have died for naught, or will teach the lessons that you wrought in Flanders fields. Michael was born in Walton County, Georgia. She was an educator who taught at several institutions, including the University of Georgia. When we entered the war in 1917, she took a leave of absence from her teaching to volunteer. After the war, she returned to the university and taught a class of disabled veterans, and it was then that she realized that they would need assistance. So she conceived of the idea of selling silk poppies as a way to raise funds, and in 1921, the poppy was adopted as a symbol of remembrance. And it's a symbol we still use today. In 1948, after her death, the U.S. Post Office issued a 3-cent commemorative stamp honoring her volunteerism and achievements. So, now back to White County. I found that after reading the letter to the editor concerning Hezekiah Miller, I became a little obsessed with the idea of honoring him in some way. I was unfamiliar with the role of African Americans in the war and what the role they played in the Great War, and I certainly didn't realize that World War I was the first time Congress had passed an act instituting a non-segregated draft. Now don't get me wrong, troops were still segregated by color, but this was the first time that all men between ages of 21 and 31 were called to register without color being a distinction. As an amateur genealogist, I had to take a peek at Mr. Miller's records, and I found where he was a handful of local African Americans who were registered. And there's his name on the little list there with some other of our veterans. Then I went on a stroll through St. John's Cemetery in Cleveland, and I found his resting place. It is my hope that soon we can clean his stone and lay flowers in honor of his service to our country. And because I was intrigued by this notion that this is the first time that men were called to arms without color distinction, I wanted to learn more about the role of African American men in World War I. And this is where I stumbled upon Eugene James Bullard, another great Georgian who is not mentioned in any of my history classes. Bullard was born in Columbus, Georgia, the son of a former slave. He was also the first ever African-American fighter pilot. He did not fly for the U.S., instead he flew for our allies, the French. Shaken by the near lynching of his father in 1903, Bullard went to England to escape discrimination. He stowed away on a freighter bound for Scotland, and then later, on a trip to Paris, he decided to settle in France. When war broke out, he enlisted and was assigned to the French Foreign Legion, serving with the 170th Infantry Regiment. He fought in the Battle of Verdun, where he was seriously wounded. He was sent to Lyon to recuperate, and later, while on leave in Paris, he decided to enlist in the French Flying Service. He went through flight training and received his pilot's license in May 1917, and he took part in over 20 combat missions. At the end of the war, he returned to Paris. He was severely wounded again in World War II, and in 1940, he returned home to the United States. In 1954, he was one of 3 men chosen to relight the everlasting flame at the tomb of the unknown soldier in Paris. And in 1959, he was made a Knight of the Legion of Honor, the highest ranking order and decoration bestowed by France. He died in 1961 and was buried with military honors in the French War Veterans section of the Flushing Cemetery in New York. In 1992, the McDonnell Douglas Corporation donated to the National Air and Space Museum a bronze portrait head of Bullard, created by African-American sculptor Eddie Dixon. He was also posthumously commissioned a second lieutenant in the United States Air Force. It is said that the emblem on Bullard's plane was a heart with a dagger running through it that read, "All blood runs red." I wish I had something profound to say to wrap up this historical exploration. Something about nobility and sacrifice and equality. However, it's not that simple. This war was complicated on many different levels, from its sheer magnitude to its lack of a definable reason for fighting in the first place. There was no great evil here like Hitler. It was almost as if a series of misunderstandings of motive and intent led to enormous loss and bloodshed. I also think there was something deeper at work here. There was this discontent with authoritarian ways that led to revolutions big and small, from peasants demanding release from czarist rule to women demanding the vote to African Americans seeking respect as equal human beings. War is not glorious, and this war in particular was brutal. However, that does not negate the fact that those who made the ultimate sacrifice deserve the recognition of their fellow countrymen, something that is being rectified in Washington, D.C. this centenary year. The war has also brought to the forefront heroes from all walks of life, not generally associated with fighting. Whether it was the war itself or some alchemy of the post-industrial age, it gave those who were previously without a voice a platform to prove their mettle, and it prompted those first baby steps toward a more egalitarian society, a society where men and women of all colors are recognized for what they bring to the table. Thank you. And I will answer questions, but remember, shot glass. So I may go, I don't know. But anyway, if anybody has a question.
Are those poppies on your pants?
Oh, yes, ma'am. I got poppies on my pants and a chicken in France. Anybody else? Billy, you want to ask that question?
Well, yeah, because when we were practicing, I told her that there was already a World War I memorial, and she said there is not, and I said there is, and so we were going back and forth, and well, she was right, but I was almost right. So can you explain the?
Yeah, Billy attended a wedding at a World War I memorial in Washington, D.C. However, it's the District of Columbia's memorial, not a national memorial. So, yes.
Do you plan to continue this study?
Yes, it's been very fascinating. I mean, you have to take it in little increments because it's heavy. It's such heavy material to work through. And I was watching a documentary about World War I and just had to take a couple weeks break. But yes, I would like to learn more. Anybody else? Yes?
So we've looked back, but the purpose of the looking back, if you'll just repeat that theme one more time.
About that this was a significant time when minorities had a role on a national, or on an international stage. It's when African Americans were recognized for what they could contribute, as were women. Women were a huge contributor, especially in the war relief effort.
And then can you speak to the significance of that in today's context?
Shot glass. No, I mean, it was a baby step. It was a tiny little step. I mean, and we still have many steps to go, but it was. I mean, women did gain the right to vote shortly thereafter, and a lot of it was, impelled by the war. We realized with all the men, or especially in England, the women realized with all the men gone that they needed some say-so in their own lives. And so, yes, I mean, the struggle is still real, but this was a start.
So your work with, so I'm gonna make sure I understand this correctly. Are you working to get a national memorial?
No, it's already in the works, and if you look in your program, there is a website for the World War I Memorial Commission. So, but yeah, it's been going on for a couple of years. They're selling poppy seeds and raising monies, and the photographs that you saw were the artist rendering of what it will look like. So anyway.
Last but not least, we will hear from Duncan Hughes. Duncan is already known to some of you as the director of the Sautee River Watershed Association. His interest in water issues began when he was just a little kid playing in the rivers of southeast Georgia when he grew up in Statesboro. Duncan lives in Clarksville with his wife Melissa and his two children, Elizabeth and Charles. Let's see, Duncan's intriguing topic is Mussels and Us and the Library of Life.
Well, I haven't been on this stage since I had a walk-on part in a production of Hair for Schubert Alley in the Valley a few years ago. It was actually a very important role because I was the one with all of the hair. I was just as nervous then, but Vicki let me have a few beers beforehand, which the SNED committee declined to allow us. I'm going to talk today about some big ideas like biodiversity and extinction and the plight of freshwater mussels that highlight these concepts. I hope that by the end of the talk, you'll further appreciate that biodiversity and freshwater mussels are important, and also that your actions are critical to protect both of them. But first, I want to give you a little context and background to explain why I'm here today. I've been interested in the natural world since I was a small child. Jekyll Island, 1975. I was about 16 months old. I like to think I'm pondering the amazing grandeur of the natural world, but I may just be wondering what's for lunch. The Ohoopee River, a few months later. That's me in the middle. Growing up, I spent a lot of time swimming, paddling, and fishing on the beautiful sandy bottom blackwater rivers of southeast Georgia. I promise that this talk today is not about my childhood. But I want you to understand that I am here today because I've always been fascinated by nature. I knew from a young age that I would do something environmental, and I fulfilled that by getting educated in environmental science, specifically stream ecology and water resources, and working in the field for over 20 years. In that time, I've glimpsed just how amazing and interconnected the natural world is. Unfortunately, I've also seen just how readily our modern society takes these things for granted. You're about to see a beautiful photo of the Chattahoochee River, very nearby where you sit right now. Please listen for a few moments to the sound of moving water. People are drawn to that. I certainly am. Water is necessary for life and the many things that we use it for. Drinking water, recreation, agriculture, and industry all depend on abundant clean water. But it's not just that. Water's good for your soul. There are deep spiritual connotations. Washed in the blood, or in this case, fecal coliform bacteria from all of that muddy water and sewer water. I think that we've all lost some of the connection to nature that our so-called primitive ancestors enjoyed. This connection is what allows us to open our minds and our hearts to appreciate and try to understand our complex and amazing world. All things are connected in nature, and biodiversity is critical to maintaining these connections. I read a thought-provoking article in The Guardian recently. I had viewed biodiversity rather simplistically as the number of different organisms that exist on Earth. More philosophically, we must understand that biodiversity represents the knowledge learned by evolving species over millions of years about how to survive through the vastly varying environmental conditions Earth has experienced. Viewed this way, we see that biodiversity is the library of life, the resources humanity may draw on and learn from to not only survive but thrive in an ever-changing world. The air we breathe, the water we drink, and the foods we eat depend on biodiversity. Without plants, there would be no oxygen, and without bees to pollinate, there would be no fruit or nuts. There are so many examples of the interconnectedness in nature, and these connections have benefits. E.O. Wilson, the father of biodiversity, compared the natural world to great artistic works. But beyond this aesthetic value, the services provided by ecosystems are estimated to be worth more than $44 trillion per year, more than double the world's gross domestic product. Yet, we don't value clean air, clean water, and healthy soil enough to account for these costs as we exploit the very ecosystems and organisms that so greatly benefit all of us. During most of Earth's history, biodiversity has been increasing, but extinctions are also a part of the evolutionary process. This is what we think of. It looks like something you'd win at the fair. Scientists postulate there have been 5 mass extinctions through Earth's history due to climatic changes like ice ages and catastrophic events like meteor impacts or massive volcanic eruptions. The loss of biodiversity from those events happened before our time, but scientists warn of a 6th mass extinction that may already be underway. This graph shows human population, the purple line, and extinctions, the green line. Note how both lines drastically changed trajectory around 1950. The correlation is very hard to miss. We compete for resources that other living organisms need. We destroy critical habitat. We divert, impound, and consume water for irrigation and electricity, and we pollute our air, water, and soil for economic gain. We are burning the library of life. I'm not suggesting that we should dehydrate or starve ourselves to save other living organisms, but that we should be intentional about how we use and protect resources so that we leave a better legacy for humanity than that we were the cause of the 6th mass extinction. Globally, there are more than 16,000 living organisms that are in danger of extinction. 1 in 4 mammal species, 1 in 8 birds, and more than 1/3 of all amphibians are on that sad list. When a species goes extinct, it creates a void in the ecosystem that may cause a cascading series of consequences for other organisms. This isn't just some problem in a faraway land. Here in the United States, there are more than 1,300 species listed as threatened and endangered. In Georgia, there are 78 species listed as such, including 49 animals and 29 plants. Of the 49 animals listed, 19 are freshwater mussels. Almost 40% of animals in trouble in Georgia are mussels, and some are already lost, like this one from the Chattahoochee. As with many other organisms, the abundance and diversity of mussel species has declined sharply over the past century. My first experience with mussels was in graduate school. My stream ecology class took a field trip to the Uchee Creek, a tributary to the Chattahoochee in Alabama. We went mussel grubbing, which is slightly more scientific than it sounds. We found some really neat species in Uchee Creek, including the shiny-rayed pocketbook, which is federally endangered. Lampsillus subangulata was my gateway into the mysterious world of mussels. It was beautiful, iridescent, and unique. It was hard not to want to learn more. Freshwater mussels are bivalves and are cousins to clams, oysters, scallops, and cockles. There are many genera and often multiple species in each genus. The mussel is a simple, soft-bodied animal enclosed by two shells that are formed by dissolved minerals like calcium carbonate extracted from their aquatic environment. The shell provides some protection from predators, and shells vary greatly in shape, size, color, and markings. Internally, the soft body consists of gills for breathing, a digestive tract for processing food, a large muscular foot for limited locomotion, and mantle tissue that produces the shell. With nearly 300 species of freshwater mussels, the U.S. has the richest diversity of mussels in the world, and we're particularly blessed in the Southeast. There are approximately 100 species of mussels found in Georgia's waters alone. The Apalachicola-Chattahoochee Flint system is very rich, with a historical documentation of 45 species of freshwater mussels, almost 3 times as many as are found on the entire continent of Europe. The mussel life cycle consists of 3 distinct life stages: the larvae, called Glaucidia, which require a fish host, free-living juveniles, and adult mussels. When water temperatures and other environmental variables are just right, reproduction occurs when the male mussel releases sperm into the water column, where it's siphoned into the female mussel to fertilize the eggs. Females brood the young from egg to larval stage in their gills. And the most fascinating part of the life cycle is how the Glaucidia are dispersed from the mother mussel. You talk about connections in nature. Glaucidia are expelled from the female mussel's gills and must immediately attach to a fished host, to the fins or the gills. Only a small percentage of the 75,000 to 3 million Glaucidia expelled into the water column actually come into contact with a fish host. The female mussels have adapted an amazing technique to increase the likelihood of survival. Just like us, they use lures to catch fish. The video you're about to see shows a mussel displaying a fish lure. It's actually a part of the mussel that has evolved to attract a fish. And that's all the little baby eggs. That's the Glaucidia. It's amazing, isn't it? And these lures have evolved to attract specific host fish. Even wilder, the oyster mussel opens its shell wide and flashes a brilliant blue mantle. The fish is lured toward the mussel, and the mussel slams its shell shut on the fish's head and holds on tight while the Glaucidia are released. Can you imagine thinking you're about to eat supper? Having your head trapped in a mussel shell with Glaucidia spraying your face? It's crazy, but you see the connections that our world depends on. If the correct host fish is not present for some reason, overfishing, pollution, habitat loss, invasive species, then the mussels can't survive. Glaucidia hitch a ride with the fish for 2 weeks up to 7 months, depending on the species. Mussels can't swim and have very limited mobility, but the mobile nature of the host fish allows Glaucidia to be transported away from the mother and colonize areas nowhere near where they were born, even upstream. Following metamorphosis, juvenile mussels drop off the host fish and take up life as sedentary filter feeders. Freshwater mussels prefer well-oxygenated, clean water and are considered indicators of healthy streams. Mussels eat algae, zooplankton, bacteria, and fine particulate organic matter. An adult mussel can filter as many 10 gallons of water per day, removing suspended particles and pollutants, resulting in cleaner water. Some mussel species can live for up to 60 years, and adults range from the size of a quarter to the washboard mussel, which can weigh 4 pounds and measure nearly a foot in length. All this is very interesting, but the wonder of mussels really hit home for me a few years ago, after years of tromping around local streams. There aren't many historical records of native freshwater mussels upstream of Lake Lanier, but I had seen a few locally in the Chattahoochee. But I had never seen any native mussels in the Sautee River watershed. However, I'd seen plenty of the Asiatic clam, an exotic invasive species that's thought to have entered the U.S. on ship's bows. One day, 6 or 7 years ago, I had my son Charles with me helping collect bacteria samples from local streams. That's good parenting, right? We pulled up to a spot on Hazel Creek and jumped out to grab a sample. Charles reached in the water and pulled out something and asked me what it was. It was a native mussel shell. We started grubbing around and found literally hundreds of them. And the size range there indicates a healthy, reproducing community. It's what you like to see. After years of seeing 0 native mussels in the Sautee, we were right on top of a mess of them in Hazel Creek. We were so excited that I called the state malacologist, Jason Wisniewski, to come up and take a look. Jason was very interested in the find and collected samples to send off to a laboratory for genetic analysis. In the field, he knew what genus it was, an elliptio, but he couldn't identify the species. The genetic results came in and didn't completely match any known species. It could even be a species that only occurs in Hazel Creek. But the really interesting part is that our elliptio is most similar genetically to a species that only occurs in the Savannah River Basin, in an entirely different watershed. We know that mussels can't sprout legs and walk over the ridge, so how'd they get here? Well, people could physically transport them from watershed to watershed, but there's a far more interesting theory that involves the concept of stream capture. During the Pleistocene, 12,500 to 2.5 million years ago, it's theorized that the rivers that now make up the Tougaloo River and flow into the Savannah River Basin were actually a part of the Chattahoochee River system, like the Chattooga and the Tallulah. At some point, stream capture occurred and flow became favored away from the Chattahoochee. This would be the drainage divide in here. So these rivers and the headwaters of the Savannah used to go this way, and now they go this way. Instead of going to the Gulf, they go to the Atlantic. The flow from the Savannah would have been at a lower elevation and flowing over more easily eroded rock that cut back into the Chattahoochee system and captured the flow of the Tallulah and Chattooga. This theory would explain how mussels that are only known to occur in Hazel Creek, one ridge over in the present day from the Savannah River Basin, would be most similar genetically to mussels that are only found in the upper Savannah River watershed. What an amazing world we're so fortunate to inhabit. But it's also a very fragile world. People have often asked me, what's the biggest threat to our environment? Here's a photo of the Cuyahoga River on fire in Cleveland, Ohio. It's one of the events that led to the passage of the Federal Clean Water Act. But in my opinion, our biggest threat is not this type of pollution, or habitat destruction, or weak environmental laws, or poor enforcement of those laws. It's the ignorance and the apathy that allow all of those other things to happen. But there is good news. I didn't anticipate this would be such a downer. I kind of feel like I'm... There is good news. There are things that you can do to help protect biodiversity and all creatures, including freshwater mussels and us. First, use less electricity. Seriously. Conserving electricity saves water and money. Almost half of the water that we use in Georgia is for heat transfer during electricity production from thermal sources like coal, natural gas, and nuclear. We pull hundreds of millions of gallons a day out of Georgia's rivers, and we only return a fraction to the source. That represents the largest consumptive use of water in our state. Next, get outside. Turn out the lights, unplug the devices, Put down the smartphone and hit the river, or take a hike. Flip over some rocks in the creek and see what's crawling around. Plug in instead to what the natural world has to say. Plant a tree. Hug a tree. Gaze at the stars. Sit by the river. Marvel at the wonders of the world. And finally, speak up at the ballot box and with your wallet. Mussels can't vote, but you can. Support leaders who make natural resource protection a priority. Make informed consumer decisions. Research the products you buy and the companies and businesses that you invest in. 35 years after I saw the ocean at Jekyll, here's my son Charles in 2010. He was 3 years old. He had a moment to observe the grandeur. This is why it matters. We must do better for ourselves, for generations to come, for freshwater mussels, and for all living things. The Library of Life is on fire. Don't just sit there. Do something. Thank you. Questions? Yes, ma'am.
What kinds of fish do the eggs attach to?
Well, they are real, most of them are very host specific, and so it would depend on which mussel. And they do, the lures attract, some of them will take anybody that comes along, they're kind of cheap and easy, you know, but some of them are very specific, so it depends. You'd have to, and you know, I'm not an expert on anything, most of all mussels, but it very much interests me.
I live in Vermont, and we actually have a problem with zebra mussels in Lake Champlain, and I guess they're now sort of overpopulating the area and cutting out the natural inhabitants. And one of the ways that they have traveled there is from boats where, you know, people are taking their boats from lake to lake and they're not fully cleaning the boat. And I was just curious when you were talking about the transfer of the other mussel, or the fact that those two mussels you were mentioning were living in two separate locations, if another possibility might be some sort of manual transport that we're, you know, somebody's boots or...
Oh, sure, yeah.
You know.
Stuff like that can happen, and with all sorts of aquatic critters, and even aquatic plants, that can happen. When a lot of places have boat cleaning, where if you're in one area before you take it to another area. But I mean, people dump bait buckets out and think, well, hey, I'm letting these little fish live, but they're dumping something that doesn't belong there. And all the zebra mussels are horrible, I know, up in the Northeast. But for sure, that's a possibility. In fact, if y'all want to, we can go get some of them Hazel Creek mussels and spread them around a little bit. I'm just kidding. I wouldn't recommend. My wife's shooting me a dirty look now. I'm like, that's a bad idea. She has to put up with this all the time. I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am.
So, the cleaning, explain that cleaning thing that happens.
So mussels are filter feeders, so they're just kind of sitting there. They're smart. They let the food come to them instead of going out crawling around looking for stuff. They just let it come to them, and they filter it. But as they filter it, that organic material they eat, it actually removes suspended particles that are in the water column. So I'm not suggesting like the dirty, muddy water in a baptism. You could put mussels out in that river all day long, and they're not going to clean that. But under normal circumstances, they will result in cleaner water because they're performing filtration just like a filter does on your air conditioning unit. Yes, ma'am.
I know in some animals, when they're about to become extinct, they help them breed in captivity. Are some of these mussels, can they be protected or extinction prevented?
Well, the groups like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, I don't know that they're propagating them in captivity, but they have. When the drought was really severe down in southwest Georgia a few years ago, there's a creek down there, Spring Creek, which is a tributary to the Flint, and it is extremely rich in mussels. And they were going and finding, you know, the flows were so low that it was pooled up. There'd be a little pool of water here and then no water and then a little pool. They were going and getting them out of there and holding on to them in an area with more oxygen and better water quality until they could bring them back and put them where they were, but they weren't actually propagating them. I don't know, that might be a business opportunity. Roy.
The introduction reintroduction work with these?
I don't know. It could possibly, if things aren't too messed up in the place that they used to be, to put them back in, but I'm not aware of that, but it could be. Are we done? Please? I'll be happy, I know some of y'all have questions too, I'll be happy to talk to you in the other room in there when we go get out of here. Thank y'all for coming.
Before we go next door for refreshments, we just quickly would like to recognize the past SNED speakers who are here. And I've seen some. Jim Smoot is here. And Jim doesn't have to stand up because he just had surgery, but the others could stand up. Robin Wilkes I saw. And Linda Dahl. And Linda Crittenden. Mike. Right. Yeah, Anna Henry Tipton. Who else? Julie Winslet.
Mike Coleman.
Mike Coleman. I didn't see. Oh, there you are. That was weird. I can't explain it. Somebody said, I thought, anyway. Anybody else?
Yay.
All right. Thank you.